and because I think we're about due to start. Lisa, I want to reintroduce Lisa. Lisa is the enabler of this morning. Lisa's absolutely amazing, and this is the second one of these that you've put together. But one of the things that Lisa and I have had great pleasure of working together is WholeEd's Words for All program. And Alex has been one of the gurus who's advised and been a guide on the side and supported us through that. But Lisa, do you want to say a few words about the program and what we're learning, and also the fact it's had a significant validation of late? So Lisa, welcome Lisa. We should all pat Lisa on the back for what Lisa has done in enabling. This is the second of these major conferences. As well, give yourself a pat on the back, all 328 or 9 of you who are still with us. But Lisa particularly, I wanted to thank for the efforts in putting together this for this morning, but also talk a bit about Words for All, because I know it's one of your passions.
Okay, thank you, David. I won't take up much of your time, Alex, and I do want to stress that it was a team effort. As everything we do, we're a whole education network, and it's only because we have such a wonderful group of head teachers and leaders and colleagues and partners in our network that this is possible, and I found this morning very inspirational, and now I'll find the next session. Thank you to Alex as well, because as David said, you've been a sort of a course textbook for Words for All. You'll continue to be so next year, and you also gave us a fantastic launch to the Words for All programme in Bolton last year, and that has had some great impact on many of the young people's lives and on many of the sort of teachers' expertise in sort of decreasing the language deficit in the young people. So a huge thank you on behalf of all of those young people who benefited from that day, Alex. The Words for All programme, it does continue. Anybody who is on here from an LA or from a virtual school, there is an opportunity for you to take part in a sort of a larger Words for All project, and we will share a link to that. And any people who are from school leadership who want to speak to their local authorities or their virtual school leads and be part of a sort of Words for All going forward, which has had great impact on empowering leaders and teachers in having sustainable long-term change and building a culture around an agency in which young people feel really empowered to improve their own language skills and development. So it's a very exciting project. We will share some information about it, but without further ado, our Words for All course textbook next year will be closing the reading gap, and I'm delighted that Alex, you've given up of your very busy time to join us today. So thank you ever so much. Over to you.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Good to see everyone. So, albeit remotely from sunny York. So in this session, I just wanted to talk around reading and the reading gap and fit it in actually with some of the previous discussions around technology use, around teaching and learning, because I think given all the the dramatic changes that we've faced over the past few months, with a move to technology that no one could have predicted, a move to remote learning no one could have predicted, I think it's important to also come back to some real fundamentals that pre-existed COVID, may have actually been worsened slightly during COVID, and then will come back with a bang when we return to schools. And that's the challenge of reading. So I want to focus in on that and reference some of the discussion from today. And there's a presentation I'd like to share.
While we're waiting for that, has it come through yet? While we're waiting for that, your summatives from the morning, things that you're taking away, and any questions and things that you want to consider, things you're grappling with, things you're reflecting with. And also, Lisa will send you some of the next up and comings with WholeEd. Alex, when you're ready, just give us a shout.
Yeah, I've emailed the PowerPoint, so when that arrives, that'll be great. I think for me, I was going to start with a very personal anecdote of my own children. So I've got 2 young kids, Noah in year 4, Freya in year 6, and since March, I've become a teacher again, which was a surprise. And obviously juggling working from home, my partner has mainly done the bulk of the home learning, but I've been helping with supplying the materials. And one of the things it brought home to me in one example where we were looking at the topic of the French Revolution And it was certainly a challenge for Noah. It was a challenge for Freya too. They were looking at different revolutions. And I really carefully calibrated a web page. It's called Ducksters. It covers a lot of interesting topics. And I've really carefully chosen that piece of reading around the Reign of Terror because it needed to be accessible for both Freya and Noah. They needed that calibration of the vocabulary being right for them, it not being too complex, it not being too long. But during the day, for whatever reason, both my partner and I weren't observing very closely. And it was interesting that my son Noah, when he was trying to undertake that task, he must have lost the link to the appropriate Reign of Terror page that I'd shared with him, and he went on Wikipedia. And if you look on the Reign of Terror entry for Wikipedia, it's quite dense. It's certainly not written for primary school age children. And what Noah had done, and I only realized when I closely looked into his written answer, he copied a chunk from Wikipedia. And I asked him to read it aloud. He struggled to read it aloud. The vocabulary was so challenging. And then I asked him what it meant, knowing, comfortably he wouldn't actually know what he'd written down. And he knew very little. And it just struck home that he'd been doing the work set. He'd been working quietly and overconfidently. And yet he didn't actually understand what he'd read. He didn't even recognize that he didn't quite understand and it was too hard. He just kind of followed instructions, went off-piste. And if that was to go untended, like a lot of remote learning necessarily will, he wouldn't actually have understood what he was reading. He wouldn't have learned very much. And it just struck home to me just how carefully calibrated any discussion of remote reading, any discussion of homework and communication over Teams, albeit instructions, it doesn't have to be reading. And then our very notion of the school curriculum and teaching and learning. The academic curriculum is mediated by reading. And when children do not have the tools, the vocabulary, the reading strategies, the understanding and how to navigate, whether that's remotely or whether it's a textbook, then actually our best laid plans, struggle. And it just struck home to me that in that small window, Noah had been getting lots of close support, but the remote learning fell down because he couldn't read and understand and access the curriculum. So for me, that struck home as something of a bit of a warning more broadly about the importance of reading and how it fundamentally mediates all of the work we're trying to undertake.
Alex, your slides are up now, so you can just say next to Alex when you
want to. So let's pop to next slide. That is just a visual of what I've just talked through, really. You can tell just the visual difference there between those two websites. I'll come back to the word reign later on as well. I think it's pertinent to come back to the knowledge required just to access vocabulary remotely in textbooks or online. Next slide, please. And one of the other warnings, we've talked a lot in the previous session around mediating technology. And one of the things we know from the research evidence on reading on screen is that actually in certain formats, it's not as effective as reading on paper. So it doesn't seem to make a difference when you're comparing fiction reading. Reading fiction on a screen doesn't seem to have a difference to reading on paper. But the evidence in this meta-analysis I've shared, the evidence is quite wide-ranging and quite long-standing that when you're reading informational texts, which frankly form a lot of the secondary school curriculum in particular, but also they're important in primary school. When you're reading informational texts on screen, there is something, when we don't exactly know why, where children don't comprehend it as effectively. It might be a degree of focus and attention. It might be something around the scrolling mechanism. It might be something around moving to other links and just a general attitude to using technology. Now, what this says to me is it doesn't say we shouldn't consider carefully remote teaching. I think it can be highly effective. We just, again, should be careful about not making any assumptions about how well students will use their technology. And yes, of course, in many ways, children will use apps and they will use technology more successfully and more confidently than their teachers. And yet when it comes to the academic content of the school curriculum, it will require a degree of expertise that's often lacking, whether you're 6 or 16. So it's just an interesting caveat here to be thinking about, given so much of our curriculum is currently mediated and there's so much reading on screen. Next slide, please. In terms of the evidence for what's happening during this school absence, we don't really know, of course, exactly the impact on children, and in different schools and in different areas, the impact will be different, and for different communities, and we know some children who just simply don't have access to technology. They don't have all those material supports. I'm sitting here at a table, you know, I've got my family who've got gadgets upstairs. You know, we know that for some children, this absence from school will be more pronounced than their peers. We also know that some are coping brilliantly with remote teaching, and some children are flourishing. I was talking to a colleague in Blackpool about a dyslexic pupil who's actually thriving not being in the classroom. And there's something interesting about being able to work at your own pace, being sometimes out of that fishbowl of the classroom space, that for some individuals, you know, they can see as a benefit. On average, we know that being in the classroom matters a great deal and has a significant positive impact on pupils' learning. So that, you know, the drive to be back in September is obvious. But we know that particularly for disadvantaged pupils and for pupils from SEND backgrounds, that transitions between year groups, between schools, and absences from school impact their learning most. So I think as we return to September, we should be thinking about those cohorts and try and glean that individual sensitive information about the pandemic experience and their learning experience and their access and practice that they've undertaken. Okay, next slide, please. This is a picture of my daughter. She's now 11. We're trying on school uniforms for secondary school, which is strange. It feels like a moment ago she was sitting in that chair. And what you see there is an image where a child is reading a book. They're pre-reading. She's not really reading the words. She wasn't able to read at that point. She wasn't that precocious. But what I've shared here is there's important evidence that before children ever get to school, the literacy environment, the dialogue, the turn taking they have with parents and caregivers is so crucial to their school success. It's crucial when they enter reception and year 1, but actually we know that your ability and your reading ability, age 5, 6, and 7, is strongly correlated with how well you do in your GCSEs and beyond. So your vocabulary, your reading ability, your early language is so critical to school success. And yes, you know, school closures right now is incredibly pressing, but it will be the 10 years of experience that many children have that will stand them in good stead over these school closures. And that early experience is particularly important. For some children, whether they're in year 6 or year 11, we need to, again, carefully attend to those literacy barriers that they face. In secondary school, many of the barriers around doing well in geography or science are not necessarily material issues. They are issues of your ability to access the complex concepts and language of science and geography, etc. Next slide, please. So here's just a quick question around book ownership. So there's a rightful focus on technology and remote access at the moment, but also book ownership for me is really important in terms of, it's probably a canary in the coal mine for the literacy environments of our children. So just reflect on that question. And then Alex, can you expose the answer for us? Oh, go back, sorry. So the answer is actually 1 in 8. So we don't have, you know, we have a lot of children in every classroom who don't have a rich literacy environment, and books are not habitual in terms of their reading. So it's just a factor that we need to consider, that more children than we think won't habitually read, They may not read books, and that's an indicator that they probably won't read on technology, at least in conventional ways. So they might be reading, WhatsApp messages, they might be watching YouTube channels, and there can be rich experiences and language shared in those platforms. However, it's not the academic language of school, the rare vocabulary that we see in books in year 5 and books in year 13 and textbooks and similar. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things I focus on is reading's complex. We need to have multiple steps. It's about your curriculum and having a reading rich curriculum. It's about reading access and reading practice. It's about teaching and scaffolding, and it's about nurturing motivation to read for purpose and for pleasure. And it's doing multiple things well. Now, there will not be a school who is not addressing reading in some form. And reading culture, some schools thrive with their reading culture, and still within those schools, some pupils will struggle. So there's something around the knowledge of every teacher and librarian and teaching assistant of all staff about understanding how reading mediates the school curriculum. Next, please. And I just want to focus a little on this strategic modeling and scaffolding of reading. And I'm going to make you feel like a student again for a short time. So if you speak German, you've got a big leg up with this task, but I'll just give you a minute just to try and comprehend as much as you possibly can from this online article. Give you some time. What can you comprehend? Can you piece it together? Okay, now some of you may be working hard with some GCSE German perhaps. Unfortunately, I didn't do German, I did Spanish, and my Spanish GCSE grade doesn't give me much of a leg up here too. I wanted you to just face that position of a student facing a really challenging reading task. Effectively, when Noah was reading about the Reign of Terror on Wikipedia, it was almost tantamount to a foreign language for him. The complexity was so far above his reading comprehension ability. But what we do as adult readers and skilled adult readers is we bring a lot of strategic skill to the act of reading. So even when we have gaps in our knowledge, and whenever pupils experience the school curriculum, there's always gaps in their knowledge. But when we do it as adults, we're strategic about it. So I assume that you piece together what you could from the available language, from BBC, from Sunday Times, from Netflix. And I think you will have been piecing that together and at least getting a gist of this text. And that's important to get a gist, and that is something to build upon. Let's move to the next slide. So here was the answer. Here was the text. And it was about Boris Johnson, and it was a matter of months ago, but it just felt like a lifetime ago, where the threat to the BBC was very live, reforming the BBC, getting rid of the license, etc. Now, I think probably everyone felt some confidence that you had the gist of this article, but now reading it in English, in plain English, you're able to get a much more nuanced, fuller comprehension. You get the full picture. And it's really important that every time a pupil enters a classroom or accesses remote learning, that they capture the full picture in their comprehension. Otherwise, they are less likely to understand, but also to remember. And how many times as a teacher have you taught a class on Monday, and you taught a topic or a concept or a word, and then you come back by Wednesday and it feels like you've never taught that topic and that or that term. And that degree of when things are difficult, you can actually miscomprehend, you could not comprehend at all, and then you move forward and your memory is compromised. And I think there's something critical here about we can have a beautiful curriculum, we can have a really well-designed curriculum, whether that's both remote, blended, in class, subject specific, skills based, And yet, if you don't read with skill, then that curriculum is compromised. Next slide, please. Now, this slide pieces together the jigsaw, and I'll go it through really quickly, but I'm actually just going to mirror the process as a skilled adult reader that you undertook when you read that article. So Alex, if you just move step by step, please. So we skim, we scanned, move forward, just keep going. Now, each of these steps, each of these pieces of the jigsaw, you will have done automatically. A little like driving a car. As an expert, we don't think of these small component parts. And yet in year 5, these component parts are often critical to comprehension. For the year 6 SATs, your ability to skim the text, to scan for the key information, and to activate your prior knowledge, make predictions, these are key to your success in your primary reading assessment. And then when you leap to year 7, like my daughter is going to do in a few months, you're reading very demanding subject-specific texts, and you're expected to do all of these things instinctively. And many readers don't. And a quarter of students enter year 7 without expected standard of reading. And that means at least a quarter of students are already going to struggle to access the secondary school curriculum. And many teachers in secondary school don't feel so confident trying to address that issue. So if we're focusing on what we do next year, let's of course focus on blended learning. Let's focus on the social and emotional needs of students as they return to school and their safety. That's paramount and number 1. But let's also not forget the crucial mediator of the school curriculum, how well we read and possessing the language of school. It's a special code and we need to teach it and we need to mediate it. Next, please. For many students that we teach, whether they're at home or in the classroom, they haven't got a neat jigsaw, they've got missing pieces, and it's not just knowledge of the world, it's knowledge of words, it's reading strategies, it's being literate and talking about what you've read and asking questions. And we need to help them piece that together. And it feels like a back to basics, because it is, because reading is the most basic but fundamental aspect of learning. Next slide, please. And I talked about those quarter of students who don't meet expected standard in year 6 and go on to secondary school, and they underperform at GCSE and so forth. And many of them are simply poor comprehenders. They don't see reading as an active process. They don't ask questions of what they're reading. They don't make predictions. They're not as strategic, and we need to be deliberate about that strategy. And we also need to be deliberate about piecing together the elements of the curriculum, the knowledge that we try to share, and helping students be skilled each time they read, especially when they're facing new challenging content they've not met before. Next slide, please. So if I was to simplify it to a formula, I think there's a big focus on knowledge-rich curriculum at the moment, and there has been for a couple of years, and I understand that, and it's an important element. But if we don't focus on helping students become strategic and independently be using those strategies, being metacognitive, then actually we won't see that skilled reading. And I think there's something here a bit more broadly about learners in our schools, where we want them to be both knowledgeable and independently strategic. If I think around so many pupils who are at home at the moment, learning remotely, they're going to need to be very strategic about tackling tasks without their teacher, often with basic instructions and with complexity. They need that support, they need to be strategic. They can get help at home from parents, but often they can't get the degree of curricular subject-specific help that's necessary. Next, please. And I want to just talk a bit about reading in the curriculum. And this is a slide I talked about in Bolton. Lisa will remember this when we talked around being word rich and accessing the curriculum, that we can have a beautiful curriculum, well designed, it looks fantastic, but if you can't read, then actually it's like having a Ferrari but not having the key. You aren't getting anywhere. And this is about how we think holistically about the curriculum, but also fundamentally about the skills and knowledge required to access that curriculum. Next, please. Yeah, next one. And just some examples here, and this is only just a taster to get you thinking around. Sometimes we need to have reading outside the classroom. We also need to try and build a rich reading around the curriculum, as well as making really well calibrated choices within the classroom. And I've selected this text here, the illustrated Usborne Guide to Dickens. I'm a huge fan of Usborne. It's mediated a lot of reading with my children at home for the last few years, and it will continue to do so, fiction and non-fiction. My daughter's reading The Kings and Queens, kind of fantastic Usborne book. I'm taking no fees for any of this. I'm just a really pleased parent. But the Illustrated Guide to Dickens is a great example where it's taken the complexity of Dickens and the full narrative, and it's mediated it really skillfully. And there's a degree of simplification here, using images, simplifying the plot. But when you actually do read the texts, they still have complex sentences. They're still rich with questions, with content. And actually, I can remember vividly with both my boy and my daughter thinking about how we had to talk about child labor, about death in childbirth, all of these quite mature concepts. But we could only access that because the text was really well calibrated for them. And obviously the skilled mediation of a parent and a teacher is key here. And that comes down to carefully crafting a curriculum and a reading rich curriculum. So next slide, please. Thank you. And I think in terms of this text here, it's a BBC magazine for history. And I won't linger on it, but just to say that, again, it's about what reading rich opportunities are we posing. So are we just undertaking tasks and sticking to the textbook, or are we creating a wider rich experience? Are we integrating the school library into the school day? For our remote learning at the moment, are we creating a reading rich experience? Because frankly, lots of reading practice over these past months will mediate any supposed gap in learning. Okay, next slide. Yeah, next slide. Go back one slide for me, please. So this is a Dorling Kindersley book. It's a periodic table. This is something that my daughter had selected and found interesting. It's one that I know was in my school library. And it looks a beautiful book, really well organized. Actually, the degree of complexity is really high. So if you move to the next slide, what I do here, and I share the RJ8 on my website, it's a resource you can use. I just break it down. What makes this text hard? Every teacher needs to understand about text complexity. And sometimes that's about the vocabulary, and for science, it often is primarily the vocabulary, but it's other features of the text as well. So Alex, if you just cycle through, you can see that this text is complex for different reasons, and we need to be able to mediate that. And if you remember right at the start, I talked about Noah and the reign of terror. And if you think about the reign of terror, I know that the word reign itself is crammed full of complexity. And it's so easy to just skate over as an adult, as an expert adult. It's so easy to skate over these seemingly simple, small aspects of learning. And then actually we lose the learning opportunity. But for so many children, they actually don't access the curriculum and they don't understand, and then they don't remember. So it's just one micro example. And is there an easy solution? There's no quick 6-week fix. There's no intervention that just fixes this. What there is a careful, cumulative, well-crafted curriculum that is rich in experience, rich in talk, rich in language, and rich in reading and vocabulary. Next slide, please. So I reassert knowledge, strategy, skilled reading, success. This is about a really broad notion of curriculum, whether that's at home, remote, whether it's blended, whether it's in the classroom. Next, please. I don't really have time to fully justify, do justice to having a reading culture. Most schools would profess to have a reading culture. I think we're going back to school with some challenges here. Some school libraries are being recommissioned as classrooms. Some school libraries don't really have the access. Many schools are thinking about the websites and resources that mediate electronic reading. I know my daughter uses a website that she reads a lot of nonfiction supplied by school, but there's something about promoting reading because it's so fundamental, not just to reading for pleasure, although that's important, but also just to school success and feeling confident and academic. Okay, next, please. There is no simple solution. So a little bit like reading on screen, there's complexities, there's challenges. So in terms of book gifting, the evidence is mixed. So we might be sending laptops home, we might be sending workbooks home or books home, and still we know that children who are weak readers or from disadvantaged backgrounds or with SEND profiles struggle to use those tools well. So let's think about the platform, let's think about the tool, but also let's think about how well our pupils access it, and reading is just so key for that. Next, please. So I'm coming to the end here, and I don't pose any simple silver bullet. I actually think we need to stop doing so many things and focus on what matters most. And I would posit, I would argue strongly that vocabulary and reading are right up there in terms of mattering most, because you cannot be a confident student, you cannot access the curriculum unless you have the language of school, unless you can crack that code. So it's really important that we offer every child that platform. And the reality is, unfortunately, that so many children have, since a really young age, been offered a rich platform for literacy. My children have bookshelves, they have literacy experiences that are really rich and privileged, and yet so many children don't. And it's those children that correlate with all of those, you know, problematic outcomes where they struggle in school examinations, they struggle beyond the school gates because they don't have that reading skill. It's not a singular solution, but it is a primary key solution for school success. Okay, next please. So I'd say, what is the one priority? What are the areas you're narrowing in? One thing around changing school days and structures, etc. If we consider that in September, a teacher is busy, they're a bit worried, they've got a new class or new classes, they've got new habits, they've got blended learning and cameras to think about, but actually with all of those new challenges, how are we going to ensure that teachers keep the main thing? And for me, one of those areas should be about accessing the curriculum, reading skillfully, the teacher making really well-chosen choices. So that for me is a key priority, and I just have an open question about what your priorities are. Okay. Now, the next couple of slides can be quite quick. So these are just some resources you can find, a couple of websites on the left. Nellie's a great support. My website at the top there has got lots of free resources, some of which I've shared. There's guidance reports on the EF website, which cover a lot of this, and book club questions, etc. And the final slide, that's just a shameless plug for my website and my endless Twittering. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alex. Lisa, have we got Jonathan for some follow-up questions, or?
We do have Jonathan for some follow-up questions. Thank you very much for that, Alex. And Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Alex, for an inspiring talk and great to hear. I think we're responsible for an English hub, so have been very involved with that national strategy for supporting at a primary level and in particular early reading, and that development through phonics. So I was just wondering your thoughts around when we come back from lockdown and there's going to be a big emphasis on maybe the gap has widened, the need for catch up, and often when we talk about catch up, a bit like pace, we think pace means talk faster. Catch up could mean do more of. Do you have any tips around, is just doing more reading going to have the catch up that people want, or do we probably need to be a bit more skillful in doing that? Any thoughts on catch up?
Yeah. So catch up, it's problematic, isn't it? I think the answer is around a really skilled set of decisions based on a really good knowledge of both reading and our pupils. So if we think around a child in year 3, it might be that their decoding was insecure, and when you take 6 months of practice out, they need to get back reading, but actually just more reading will be insufficient. They might need to go back to some of those, phonic patterns. They need to consolidate those patterns before we then try and motor with some wider reading. And then if I move forward to year 7, you've got many pupils who are joining secondary school, and they're about to read for 90% of the time dense informational texts. And so they can decode those texts, but the problem becomes having the wider knowledge and strategy to access them. So for me, it's about really knowing reading and knowing your children. And in a year 3 classroom and a year 4 classroom, your diet of reading should be rich, and you should read lots. But for many pupils, they'll need a really targeted approach. So for the English Hub, the focus, particularly in Key Stage 1, will be around ensuring decoding and fluency and word reading are set, because that is the platform, that's the foundations for comprehension. For some children in year 3 or year 6, reading more will be valuable. Reading more broadly will be valuable. Strategic reading of informational text will be more valuable. So there isn't a just read more. Generally, that's a good thing, but it needs to be, the content of what is being read needs to be well chosen. The strategies and the teaching needs to be well calibrated for the needs of the group. So if you've been at home for 6 months struggling with decoding and word reading, then you need some pretty deliberate catch-up intervention when you come back. So it's skilled focus on need.
Brilliant. And I think, as you say, great advice there, because I think it is that often that systematic and very regular intervention to secure that knowledge base to enable children to have the fluency to enjoy reading. So you've touched upon culture and a reading culture, in that sense that schools know we've got to teach reading, and we talk about culture as though it's easy, but it's quite hard to define, isn't it? And so to what extent do you actually think the school culture around reading has the impact on reading? Because if we've got intervention and structure and support, and I'm actually thinking more at Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, where often there's maybe a sort of an assumption that reading's done in year 1 because we have a phonics reading test, and actually those deeper skills that you've been talking about are really needed. The more widely you've got to read and the more in depth you've got to read, that actually teaching of reading is not just the decoding of early reading, is it? It's the depth of reading that you've been talking about. So can culture alone do that, or should we be more intentional at Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 around reading and teaching of reading?
Okay, so I think for me, often our reading culture seems to attend the motivation to read and reading for pleasure, which is an important component. It can be an as important component as decoding and reading comprehension strategies. They all matter. But I think if our reading culture pretty much orientates around, like, World Book Day and, some kind of the odd approach, and it doesn't fully integrate systematic training of teachers and curriculum design that embeds reading with careful strategies to understand reading barriers, then actually you can have a lot of motivation to read, and then a quarter of pupils stubbornly don't read very well for a long period of time. And I just in the comments, Claire Percy mentions the likes of reciprocal reading. For me, reciprocal reading is a really effective approach to building reading comprehension strategies. So if you've got a school where you're focusing on getting the platform right for decoding, you've got a really intentional approach to reading strategies, you've got an intentional approach to motivation and reading access, and having events that celebrate reading, I think what you note is a reading culture that is multi-stranded, that is complex, and that becomes an integral part of everything you do in school. And I think a culture can be an amorphous thing, and actually we need to be more intentional and specific about what we mean by a reading culture. And in my book, I share a couple of schools. There's a school in Blackpool, St. Mary's, and a school, St. Matthew's in Birmingham, a primary school. And what I note about both those schools, they've got quite different beliefs and different phases, so a different emphasis on reading, but they're both highly intentional. They've got clear structures. Every teacher is trained to apply those structures well. They both celebrate reading, but they do so much more than that. And so I think intentional, careful culture building is absolutely key, and it's multi-stranded.
Thank you very much, Alex. Again, always inspiring, and thank you, Jonathan, for taking us a bit more behind the thinking. That notion of intentional culture is really powerful. I think it is that combination, and culture isn't an amorphous thing. Getting the culture right, everything else follows. But I like the notion that you've put of intentional culture, and in Words for All, we've always said it's the two things. You've got to get the attitude and the motivation, but it's what you do and the specifics that are important. Alex, thank you for all you've done in supporting this event this morning, but also Words for All as a programme. For closing words and the what next, Lisa. Are you muted, Lisa?
There we go. Right, almost got there without doing that, David. Almost 2 minutes to go. So again, thank you to everybody, and I will go around the room and thank everybody in a moment. But just to reiterate, if you do have that priority, as Alex has quite rightly said, it should be, you know, something every school is thinking about. And certainly if you're in the secondary school sector, please do look at the links that Alex from Whole Ed has shared regarding Words for All for next year. And it does develop leaders and teachers in strategies to improve reading in their schools, in their settings with their students. So it would be really brilliant if people would encourage expressions of interest from LAs and virtual schools on that. So to go around the room then, a huge thank you to Alex and Jonathan, who we've just heard from in session 4, to Shona, Les, and also to, so we had Shona, we had Les and Jonathan who were in session 3. Sorry, Jonathan, you skipped off my order then. Huge thank you to Ruth. John's obviously gone off to speak, and Shona for their inputs in session 2, and thank you to James from GL and to Hannah, and again to John, who's gone off to teach his sort of group of boys that he works with on expeditionary learning. Thank you to Danielle and to Dan for all of your work putting this together, and again for encouraging a second event like this. I hope we have many in the future, both face-to-face and both virtual. And of course, thank you to Alex and Charlotte, who are keeping everything going behind the scenes from Whole Ed. And it just remains to say a thank you to David, our host, our sort of facilitator, for bringing this all together. And it looks like we're running exactly on time, and there's only one person in the world I know who can manage that every single event we have, David, and that is you. So a huge thank you to everybody. Those of you who are listening and viewing, we will try to get back to all of your questions and comments. Please do take a moment before you log off to just share some of your closing thoughts with us, with the panel, and sort of things that really did resonate with you and things that you're going to take away from the 4 sessions today. It's always wonderful to be able to share the fantastic Whole Education Network and our partners and friends of our partners with you, and it's just been an absolute delight. So please do take a moment to add to the chat, and again a huge thank you to everybody who's been involved today.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you everybody.